Taché delay. I hope you had a nice day off yesterday.
The
Good. I did also. I visited the spice market in Mundgod. As you know, we are talking about different sensory systems this week. And they include vision, touch, hearing, and we'll also talk about olfaction or sense of smell. In each of these sensory systems, we have receptor cells that are outside of the brain that are detecting physical properties of the world around us. So my first question for you today is, what is the largest sense organ of our body?
Body?
That's correct. Our skin. This is the largest sense organ of our body. And today we'll be talking about your sense of touch and how it's conveyed to the brain by different types of receptor cells. So to go over the learning objectives, today we'll define somatosensation. You should be able to describe, if I asked you on an exam, how we process touch, vibration, heat, cold, and painful stimuli. And you should be able to name the different types of receptor cells in the skin. There's a lot of vocabulary to learn. We may ask you on the exam what types of physical stimuli would cause nerve impulses in the somatosensory system. I will also talk to you about the anatomical pathway from your skin into your brain. And you will also learn, and I may ask you on an exam, how that information about our body is represented at the highest levels in your brain in the structure called the cerebral cortex. And then finally, if we have time, I hope that we will discuss some unusual conditions, some medical conditions where the individual has a hypersensitivity to touch or experiences excessive pain. Okay. So we're talking today about the somatosensory system. And the first thing that you need to know is that your skin is filled with receptors. Cutaneous receptors are in your skin, and there are many different types. We have sensory receptors for touch, for pain, for hot and cold. And because each of these senses uses a different receptor cell type, we can think of the somatosensory system as a system of systems for touch. And each of the receptor cells located in our skin or located in our joints has a receptive field. Do you recall from the primer the term receptive field? Okay, we will talk about this in another slide, in a few slides. Fundamental, important concept that we will talk about today, tomorrow, and all week. So you need to learn the concept of a receptive field, and I will explain it for the somatosensory system, and Professor Iovone will explain it for the visual system, and you will see that for each receptor type, there's a particular receptive field. Another important concept is that for hot and cold and touch, that information is carried from the skin through the nervous system up to the cerebral cortex separately. So for each of those senses is kept separate as a separate piece of information all the way up to the cerebral cortex. So it's not until that sensory information reaches the highest level of processing in the cerebral cortex that it's combined together so that we can identify objects such as this control by its shape, by the pressure, perhaps it vibrates. It's all combined together for the first time in the cerebral cortex. So in addition, we have proprio receptors that are located in our joints and in our muscles.
tadana ngaju shane da tanda papa da thik da dige ring na la ngaju shane gi tanda lu gi phapyur nile ba de zuri de res.
And these sensory receptors tell us when our muscles are stretched or when they're contracted.
Nile ba dige chele khari dugur la na ngaju shane di zo kyang do kung do di tangi jura di cha de res.
They also tell the brain, they provide information about how fast our arm is moving, the velocity and the force of movement.
Thana shunga zo pongba lawa de zo khabas pyoglo yugu yeme jora di ne chu level tangi dige nile ba dige rik cha de res.
So let's review, before we get into the deep details about the somatosensory system, let's review some general concepts about sensory coding.
Tanda lusur mala ting sabu mandu kola ani tanda onsur gi tajur cherim digan chik to is.
So there'll be a physical stimulus. That's the initial step in sensory coding. In our case, we might be talking about light touch, or a pinch, or a painful stimulus, like a mosquito bite. That's the initial stimulus that happens at our skin.
Dila do onsur gi tajur cherim jua di na la ta thangbo de khari chawi la na korim thangbo de chi ku yen di res chi ku yen an thanda jo lusur da cha sha na nem ba ina re yana chao da thamo thue da yana thungtang gi so ja na di sama khari cha de la na chi ku yen di res.
That initial stimulus causes a change in the sensory cells located in our skin. It's usually a mechanical stimulus that causes those cells to become electrically excited.
Dila do ku yen di le sa je la nang lo la onsur thabong yo ro as onsur mala da de di ani onsur thabong di da di ko chu res lok da di.
When you look at this, does this look familiar to you from last year's studies?
Ta naning zida phe ras dina la an thanda de la tigri do shtun shadas this ko chu do sa karim ba ha go de thing de chi. Yes, they remember.
Some of you are saying yes? Yes? Okay. So this is a way that we represent electrical activity in a neuron.
Ta lok da gi cherim ju ra zo ong je na la di en chunje no zo di phe ju chi gi ras.
And when a neuron is excited, it fires an action potential.
Ta da na zo ong je tha su de ju no zo li ju ni ba ko chu gu ras di chung gu ras de.
An action potential is a change in the electrical potential of the membrane. So neurons normally are negative, have a resting membrane potential of about minus 60 millivolts. When they're depolarized and fire an action potential, they become more positive inside with respect to the outside. And they fire, so the cell becomes more positive during an action potential.
Ta onse tha su na thingi dos leju mobile twin sa je na jo ithanda log ni ba jora thambo moda tuchula sha dos dila do ta surne ni ba di cha de ras dine ne ithanda leju mobile le do wala ya phota la du yas.
And at this point, if a receptor in our skin is excited, it reaches a threshold, the cell will fire more action potential. So this is a signal that something is happening in the skin.
Ta ku je shuk chimbo ngaro do ste oina ta thabu na khare tingur launa leju mubadi shuk cheru du ras mama du ras thanda dina chungu dos thambo de nyo para chikten dos di chungu res.
And this electrical activity is carried by axons from our skin into our spinal cord.
Ta thanda di ne chu di khol lo ne chu di da di khol du launa papa ne ma ju tumba ba du res ne chu di.
Or in some cases, that activity may enter the brain stem higher up.
Kabre kharchi wala na thanda di da ju ro tumba chu mai ba che le sha byo kam ba du res ta di.
And from those initial synapses in the spinal cord of the brainstem, we have specific pathways for carrying somatosensory information further up where it's processed in the cerebral cortex.
Ta thanda ne chu di tumba le wa na re le sha na le wa na di je la ya ne chu do dang ju ro di khoran ju king lo wa ji cha de res ti.
And only by combining information about all of the different senses in our skin do we have perception, a perception that will allow us to grasp objects and identify them.
Dile dünne tu di samma da leşu lesa jela nesu durup chigrelara di jel dushe di kiyores di kesa jela ni mobodi ma tu chore che ngara su laba chen da di samma chigres.
And ultimately, information from our sensory receptors in our skin is combined with visual information or perhaps olfactory information that is combined to create the perception of an object or a part of our world.
다가 모보지 요나 디 두셰케라 단다 소로디 상마 추그레스 단나 아주 빡베다 류다 제 셰라스 단나시 통소르다 디 상마냠도 듀니 아니 단다 두셰케 저로 모보디 콜라 딜리레스.
So when we identify an object like a mango and we perceive it to be smooth and soft, it has a particular smell and a particular color, and if it's ripe, we can identify that based on the color as well as how it feels.
다 모보로 차셔나 아주 신데 아마주여나스 암주여나스라 딩 아주 카르치르라나 통그로와스 태어나시 디 카도 카리메 잠보 유메다 디 상마 통그로와스 아니 티마에 나모 유메디 상마 타이로와스 태어나시 딩 아주 디 추유메 디 카를 하고 올라와나 카도를 하고 올라와스.
Okay, now I want to talk more specifically about the receptors in the skin, and in the second half of the lecture today we'll talk in much more detail about the specific types.
다다나 안조 파베난 기 파소 네림바 디게 릴라트레이스 아니군 잡라딘조 시타 레레레 마티에스 네림바 디게.
So we have different receptors that encode pain, heat, cold, or touch and vibration.
다다나 안조 수무이다 차와다 차와다 아니 레고다 디 상메기 아니 레 쿠란조 레레라 네림바 체라바 레레레스.
And we also have, so these receptor cells, this is the surface of the skin in this diagram. This is a magnified view of a little piece of your skin.
다다나 델레 물 파르치 튼쇼다스 디 카레 춘겨 라오나 안조 빡빡이 차시 춘주 질레라 디 파르데 침부 갸샤요르지레스.
And these are hairs that are in the skin.
디 강 디 카레 춘겨 라오나 빡베 모이디레스 라 디 안디 카르라나 안조 빡베 갈 파부요스 타 춘주 질레스.
So underneath the epidermis, the outer layer of skin, we have these different sensory receptors for touch.
다디나 차샤나 디 치카리스 춘고라나 림바 탐보들 에피더미스 라기레스 디기 월라 카리르라나 다다넬레바 레레레레스.
We also have sensory endings around the follicle of hairs.
타나시다 단다 초로다 제웨 네모디 콜르라나 단다 부디기 워즈도 자와델 딜레 투디레스.
And each of these receptor cells transmits information about different kinds of sensory stimuli on our skin along these nerves.
딜레 디 치쿠징 이네수 딜레니 넬레바디기 네수 디 다디마 디와라 온살 타수 온살 당규 레스다디.
So, yeah, it's number 5, should be number 5. Now I want to come to a discussion of receptive fields.
다다나 넬렘베 라와 레조라 넬랭기 라와 카리기레 미디가라니 초두르체 레슨스.
I think that the concept of receptive fields are one of the most difficult concepts in neuroscience for beginning students to understand.
다넬레 라와 레조라 디 온제 세리나라다 고든 카슈로지 차드 레스티 록투딘 줄 고츠요라.
So I would like you to ask many questions about this if you don't understand what I'm talking about.
제자다 넬레 라와디 카푸요라디 키나조 고마츠오이나 티오티양 치로치스.
In this let me explain. In this diagram, we have a patch of skin on the back of your hand.
다디 리무나라 카리올라나 만조 라페이 갸블라 pakpe chashi chunju ji tön shados.
And if we were to magnify this, enlarge this patch of skin,
tanda tushi na mo shtön dos pakpe ne di chashara di kesi chosyo ina wala ru chimbu shtön do tinde do shtungules.
This is the region where those receptor cells are located that I showed you in the last slide.
다 단단 내지 통고 도스 디 가르치고 올라나 단단 내래 라디 추기레스.
Each of the receptor cells can only respond to a tiny patch of skin.
다 단다 내랭기 타분 주라 디 차샤와나 단다 빵페나 따와나 차시 춘주지 마시 네 춘주지 마시 리뷰 마레스티.
So for a particular receptor cell, it has a region of the skin that it senses or can respond to, this small region of skin. And that region does not overlap with this particular receptor cell. It's some distance away.
다 내랭기 타분 디 따와나 코랑기 내직 차도 도스티. 당나시 디로 차샤나 코랑기 내 도스. 디니 찍은 찍 대기요라는 대기요 마레스.
So this is how, for example, we can tell if a mosquito bites us here or over here.
세상디 내내기 근데 쿠이디 로가로가 차두거나 다 계란조 두장기 소자와나 내나겨도 대겨 계란조 여체 두도스 니디.
Okay? But the other point I want to make is that receptive fields in the skin overlap. So there are no gaps. There are no places on our skin where we're completely insensitive to touch.
이내 단다 내내기 라와주라 라와디 가르차되려나 지간직 데브데교데레 차되레스. 세상 기만의 동바지를 하고 말레스 찍이를 레데레스 라와디게.
So it's a little bit like the tiles on the floor. There are no gaps between the tiles.
디 가리도 차되려나 가란소이디 캄바 샬랄 팅교 도지도 타일 데주로 차되레스. 디 따와나 찍이 튀데도스. 디 파라 동보메도스 디로리스.
When a particular stimulus excites the sensory receptor in the skin, it generates an action potential that travels down this axon.
다다나 치 구jengi 계시데라 롱와이나스 데라 치 구jengi 직다 다지 구jengi 스테와이나스 디 아니 단다 원주기 디 가르차들라나 다게 자테 레스 다게 제든 마디 달리주노바디 마투 레스네.
And because these axons have myelin, and these are regions of the axon that are covered in myelin sheath, that allows the information to travel very fast down the axon into the nervous system.
다다나 왕제 말라나디 다게 자린 차들와스 다게 자린 디 모부시 톰샤도스 디 카르나나 페지레디레스 디 페지 톰샤도 발라
And in these sensory neurons, the cell body is located in a group of structures that run alongside our spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglion. And they send their axon into the spinal cord or the brainstem. So these neurons are a little bit different from other neurons that you may have heard about because they have a sensory process in the skin. The cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion, and then they send an axon into the spinal cord. So they're located outside the central nervous system in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, next slide. To understand how we can perceive touch or pain or hot and cold, we need to understand how the receptor cells convert physical information, like hot or cold, into electrical potentials or into action potentials. So here's an example of one type of receptor that's located in our skin that senses deep pressure, like vibration. And it's encapsulated by these outer layers of membrane.
Tanda di tasu tena nelemba yimba chashasra wangso nelembani. Di ani tanda phari chorgu yorlawana di tanda nelemba phari nelemba chadyorlana nenshu yorwa dargui roda de nelemba chadyores. Di koran chashawana di tanda khari korsherlawana kimoji gitom shayores.
For this type of receptor, deep pressure causes the sensory fiber to stretch open a little bit. Tiny channels stretch open in the fiber.
Tanda di galang zo nenshu chimbuji chi guje nenshu chimbuji teoinas di nanglo la chagyu yorwas di khachilana yak shangyu yores.
And if we take a little tiny piece of that fiber and now magnify it over here, we can see that the membrane has these tiny ion channels in it, tiny channels.
Tanda thagren chagyu do yora the fiber lady. Di kesi chimbu suni taona di nanglo langjo khanda khedul yam adose gi lam yora channel dige thungures.
So normally, when there's nothing touching our skin, these channels are closed.
Ta kesi chi guje ngjo tanda la ba chawa la ora ke chawa me wainas rese ke guj thu menas so mena andi tanda gulam jido khedul do se gulam di khaja shayures.
But when a stimulus, for example, a pressure on our skin, causes these channels to open,
Ta kesi guje ji tewa nasra peshona nushu roji. Di tewa na an papa de tidu khachirlana anda di khedul gi gulam jido di khachigres.
and when these ion channels open, they allow sodium ions to flow into the neuron, depolarizing.
Di la de ta di gulam de khachedu wala sodium gi khedul jora di nanglo juye ko chugres.
Do you remember that when a neuron is depolarized, sodium ions flow across ion channels in the membrane into the cell?
Di la de depolarize la yo di nebo bimbe kapso khana zo thingi des di tanda khedul dosa gi lam di khache ani sodium de zo nanglo jugu yo thingi des di.
Yeah, okay, good. So when that happens, we can measure in that neuron the change in electrical potential.
Ta tanda di kimo jora di nanglo nganzo khari cheje la oina tanda logi ni ba la electric potential di ta roas khaga swimeli.
And in this lower diagram, what we're seeing is a graph of the change in electrical potential. So here is the stimulus, weak, moderate, or strong.
Ta tanda wala tigrish ten doas di nang khari ten la ona kuyen gi shu chele jora chejum di ten res tangshu di cha sha na kuyen ko shu chimbu shira me was ten res kima di ting zam ten res kuyen an tama di kuyen shu chimbu shte shira di ten res.
So weak touch, harder touch, or a strong touch to the skin will create different changes in the sensory neuron with
Ta tanda di nganzo labo chaya di ke shi ras kuyen tanda di cha sha di pampa de tera di la du labo khali chawa na re shu chimbu cha na di la shu chawa na ta nganzo di khari gyo du la na tanda nganzo wangsor da de wangze ta su jora di la gyo du ras ke ba su ras de.
So for example, light touch may cause just a few of these channels to stretch and open.
Ta cha sha pe sha nas tanda labo chandu gal shu chimbu shira ma chawa nas di la du tanda gulam jora kedul rosa gulam khashe ma shi khachi yo ma ras tigal.
Whereas a moderate stimulus, stronger pressure on the skin, would cause more membrane stretching and more ion channels to open.
Di la du ta nganzo ya ne shu sti ras ne shu de shu che te nas di ga su kharchi la na kedul rosa gi lam jida kedul gi lam ma khachi res di la du ani di na kedul ma du res ki.
And with an even stronger stimulus, many of the ion channels would open. The neuron would become depolarized and send an action potential into the spinal cord.
Tana shi ne shu chimbu shte nas di la che shte na kharchi la na kedul ma khachi en tana shi sodium gi kedul ma bu ji ma jo le ju mi ba de tung res dina.
So with these differences, these graded potentials, with a weak stimulus, a moderate stimulus, or a strong stimulus, the sensory neuron will release different amounts of neurotransmitter, a small amount or a very large amount of neurotransmitter.
다른데 꾸진 라떼니 케바두로 레슬라라스 꾸진 체중 라떼니 딜파베 먼저 왕세 팀바주야 왕세 팀바 망용 딜파베 루요레스 케시 꾸진 충아요나 왕세 팀바 용아 루요레스 꾸진 셔이나 왕세 팀바 망아 루요레스.
So for a given type of receptor, changes in the intensity of the stimulus are converted into different amounts of neurotransmitter release.
Diladu chi kuye latani dil gyo do wala di dilateni khari chungur lawana wangze timba loya jura dila gyo do res chi kuye shuk chejung latani.
In the next slide, you can see some more examples of how this works.
Tadanda jela pezu shimba mangush tongos di gyuni khranju di toda gyurim jura leha handes chiwe me seu chagres.
So now I'm going to introduce the names of some of the sensory receptors in your skin. So for example, the first one is the Meissner corpuscle, the Merkel cells, Pacinian corpuscles, and Ruffini endings.
Tadanda tanya kashi jishe is di kharida de chawolana tanda wangso nelemba rexol nelemba de chadures and tanda dinan chashawana tanya kashi jures nelemba de mingres chigla Meissner corpuscle lagures chigla Merkel Drepung lagures chigla Pacinian Corpuscle lagures chigla Ruffini orange lagures.
These are very strange sounding terms for receptors because they were named after the scientists who discovered them.
Dila dita dinzo nelemba mingdo chashayarada di chi dinzo kenso sol doas kenazo kajin relana dinzo tanda ming mangbuji doas di khari relana kuransu seriba yora sarnye chung chingi gi seriba kuransu ming chadures.
So Meissner and Merkel were two German scientists, and Pacini and Ruffini were two Italian scientists.
The Meissner the Merkel do chashana kurani Germany seriba yora the German seriba res German misel thana shi Pacinian the Ruffini di Italy seriba res.
So perhaps someday we will discover a new receptor in the skin and we'll name it after one of you.
That chiksina nimachi kiranzu wini da kiranzu ichiki da nelimba sawaji sanye chuana kiranzu itminchi ligi girestiga.
Now, below the different types of receptors, we have the different receptive fields for that receptor.
Thana nganzu dela nelimba mandra mangu chiwas lowa chadu rasi and thana ju kuranzu gi da nelingi rawde minda yores kuranzu rela.
So here I want you to imagine we're talking about the tip of your finger.
And
in the tip of your finger, in fact, on this surface of your hands, you have the highest density of sensory receptors in your whole body. And that makes us very good at identifying objects even when our eyes are closed. So in the example of the Merkel cell, the endings are very, very tiny receptors, and those receptors have the smallest receptive fields.
Tadanda Merkel Drepung do chashawanas Drepung di nemo tawana chunchu mangbush doas nemo dela dige ne tanda nganzo gi nele gi rawa tawana nele rawa chungshu di chadu res Merkel Drepung di.
So these might be the receptors that we use when we're feeling something rough, when we're feeling tiny edges of objects. They give us very precise localization and information.
Di rig di nelimba di khari ha nesu khari ha burlawana nemo roda din nga zula cha de thada din de imba che thana shi chuplu khawa swime jora din nesu ha ngi rig di cha de res nelimba di.
So in contrast, the Pacinian corpuscle is deeper in the skin, it's much larger, and it has a larger receptive field.
Tadanda Pacinian corpuscle lan chik do niliba di do cha shawana pakuna tawana ma ting le res ani koran jo ithana ne tawana ge che res di tabung di che an tawana shi digi thanda nile rawa di che res.
The other night when we were celebrating Buddha's enlightenment in the Great Hall with chanting, I could feel vibrations from the chanting in the floor. And that was information conveyed by Pacinian corpuscle in my hand. So these receptors encode not only where a stimulus happens on our skin, but also how intense that stimulus is. There are two ways that the receptors convey information about the intensity of the stimulus. The first is how many action potentials are fired. And the second way is how long the neuron fires, how long of a period of time it continues to fire. So coming back to the Pacinian corpuscle, that's very good for sense of vibration.
The Pacinian corpuscle do cha shauna digi soro khari kan kembu cha de laona dargu de deo cha de waste.
If we have a very long stimulus, this receptor only fires at the onset of the stimulus and then when the stimulus goes off.
Dilu tanda chi kuje gyurung bu steo inas di thambo kharchi launa tanda wangza chasu de la the kumashtini the kaptu do digres and ma jam shadu wala ma zotu restia.
In contrast, the Merkel receptor fires as long as the stimulus is present.
Ta di da hande tangur lawana chi kuje di during lo khagas yeme di khagas yo di ani lokda trin de jura di do digres.
So what the Pacinian corpuscle really cares about is when the stimulus begins and ends.
The Pacinian corpuscle do cha shauna chi kuje khadu gozu imeda khadu jam sha imedi seu shetu res.
But the Merkel cells are interested in the stimulus as long as it's present on our skin.
Dila de Merkel tabu do cha shauna tanda chi kuje di during le khagas de me jora stimulus tanda chi kuje di yo kap di ne ju di ko jutu res.
So just to summarize, we have many types of sensory receptors in our skin, and each convey information about a particular location on the skin, and they convey information about the intensity of the stimulus by changing their firing rates. Now, I want to remind you about the general anatomical organization of the somatosensory system. And you saw this from Professor Yvonne's talk, but I want to remind you again that the peripheral receptors in our skin or our joints and muscles transduce mechanical information into electrical impulses.
tanda lusur malagi ni phungne dulu di chidang di kor sharing is di nal chi manju tanda shane da di ge di ani thagor onso neli ma di cha dio ras di ge en manju lushu ki tanda ni baro laura di ani tanda logi ni go di change cha dio ras.
And the way that the receptor cells do this is through graded release of neurotransmitter onto the sensory ending of the neuron.
Ta wangze na lo nemo jura dina ani chi ku yen tani ani lokta tuen jura di chi yor was che lo na dil pabe.
The primary sensory neuron is conveys that information into the spinal cord, and they're called the dorsal root ganglion.
Ta na ngarim gi wangsa ta su da dige dige ne chu di khol tang yor la na to the spinal cord, right? Ani jumbo la tang yor res.
And we have many of these dorsal root ganglia all along our spinal cord.
Ta tanda ne chu di jumbo la tang yor res di khol tang yor la na kyamu gi cha du yor dorsal root ganglia dil li tang yor res. An tanda ma chu jumbo la ta na de jumbo tanda cha du mambu ji yor res.
And just like if you were to take a bus to, I don't know, Delhi. Well, that's a long way. You would have to stop at many stations along the way to change buses.
Ta kiranzo tanda Delhi bodo chijo longo na drogu las ta phabzo mambu ji jo gyao ki ras.
Also, in the somatosensory system, the information has to go through several different structures in the brain before it's processed and combined in the cerebral cortex.
Dila de ta neshu bodo mala konla ani kurim mambu ji drogu ras ti ne ji sama du ko di kurim mambu cha de res.
So after the dorsal root ganglion neurons project their axons into the spinal cord or the brainstem, and they form a synapse there. So that's the second synapse that's important here.
And the gamu cha du jura koran su bi tanda dage cha di lesha bi ba na re jumba ina re dil ma tang ras di tang du gala ni koran su sponsor ta su ni ra di pharge ni thujam di chayo res.
And then the spinal cord or brainstem neurons send axons into the thalamus.
Ta tanda jumbe ye tanda wangza ta su ju ras di ro cha sha na ni koran su gi wangza ta su di gi dage cha di hol tang ri la na lebu la tang yor res.
The thalamus is a structure that receives sensory information about hearing, vision, and somatosensation. So it is a relay structure, if you will, like a bus station.
Ta tanda lebu la na khandi jira na bus station do chijo longo phabzu do ji cha de res. Digi tanda wangchur gi ni chu yora thong chu ri na re ta su ri na re thoi sor tanda khari na thi sor khari na di ni ju sama lengi di lesa di khari cha de la na ta sama jomsa do di ani lebu di cha de res.
But each type of sensory information goes to a different part of that bus station.
Ine ta ni su logo yor was din su ni su logo din su koran su ne logo cha de res bus station gi ne ta na sama chi la li yo mares ne logo cha de res.
And from the thalamus, that sensory information travels up to a specific region of the cerebral cortex.
Ta tanda di ne ni ya ne chu ra gyo jura di khol dur la na leshun la du res. En leshun la do ene ge koran su ne logo cha de res sama chi la li yo mares.
In the case of somatosensory information, it travels to a region of our cerebral cortex called the parietal cortex.
Ta tanda leshun do cha sha na di ne khol la na tanda chukdap ya chukshun chola ni chukshun la ni chi res de la li yo res ne de.
So now we'll take a look at the dorsal root ganglion neuron and talk a little bit about this concept that different types of sensory information are carried separately into the spinal cord or the brainstem.
Ta gamu cha du ju ras di ge thana ma su ne ju sama le ne su di khol tang yor la na ena jungba la tang yor re na ani lesha la tang yor was.
So an important difference is shown here with the sensory cells that convey information about touch versus the sensory cells that convey information about pain and temperature.
Tila da mau je da mo ta lo kya dos chik cha shawana tanda riksha da dewe nile bache chik di khari cha urlana sumu da dewe nile cha de ruas loga yores tini.
In the case of sense of touch, all of those different receptors in the skin send their information from the dorsal root ganglia into the spinal cord. Here's a picture, a cross-section of the spinal cord.
Ta tanda di cha shawana tanda riksha da dewe ra chi kuye riksha chili ona di ne su di call dur la ona tanda gyabze cha du jua del li yores and dine ne su di jumba la tang yores. Ta di tanda remote to ndo ngombu chimbudi di khari chundur la na jumba sha sha gyo di thela sha gyo tende jires.
Have you learned about the spinal cord before?
Jumba ko la jamnyo yores ngela.
So this mixed responses. So if we, the spinal cord runs from the top of our neck all the way down to the end of our back.
Tadanda jumba de khane bochugo lana jimba ro gap di kejdo di chashana dine ne che ani khada gap di neshdo di boduli yores.
And as you recall from Professor Ivoni's talk, some of those axons carrying information from, say, your big toe have a very long way to travel.
Ankira jo ge mai gi khotni la she swas exo dage chati khashi khari la na tanda theo jidra kangbe theo dine ne chini gang boduli gri jumba boduli gri lan rebu shu yo she swas.
So sensory information from my big toe will travel into my spinal cord from dorsal root ganglion neurons that are located in my lower back.
Dilla du tanda ne su jira wangso ge ne su di phane kangbe theo ne go chu ne su di du yo ras di khol du la na tanda jo ya kyamne cha du jua del du yo res and di ngazo khol la na tanda gap kite ne su do del li yo res.
And sensory information from my fingers will be conveyed by dorsal root ganglion neurons that enter my spinal cord on the upper part of my back.
Tanda zugu gi tanda wangso ne su jira wa nas di ne su di drone khol li la na gap gita teng chola ra gang chola ne su di li yo res jumba icha shauna.
And in the case of the dorsal root ganglion neurons carrying information about touch, they enter the spinal cord in the back of the spinal cord, the dorsal part of the spinal cord.
Tanda di sadu kemnu sadu jura dine ne su di khol tangir la na jumba tangir ras jumba gi ne khol tangir la na gap cho jura di chol tangir res dorsal na gap la.
And those axons travel then up the spinal cord until they make a synapse.
Ta dine su di dine ya khol tangir la na di jumba gi kang padu tangir res de la khari sur la na jumba da tanda di chadu ga ji thuzam di chagir res.
In the case of pain, those dorsal root ganglion neurons send their axons into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord where they make a synapse.
Ta tanda dine ne su di phane go chu ro pa pa ne go chu ni ani gyamwe sadu de che gyamwe sadu ne su di tanda ngo gi jumbe gi gap cho jura de la an korani gi thuzam di su gi res.
And then the next neuron conveys that information about hot, cold, or pain by crossing to the other side of the spinal cord and sending axons up the length. So a different pathway.
Dila ta di tanda chau da thamu khari me ge ni su to sa di ros mo bodi dila de la yan tanda di jumba de la cha di thunjam su res mon je thunjam su sa je la ni jumba khora thela ta wa na khatu du do as di mon za tha su di dine che ni ya du res dila du dini gulam loga do as.
Yes. So here you can see in this slide the anatomy of the somatosensory system. So in this case, you see the brain and the spinal cord.
Ta tanda lusur mala da de cha de res dina khari su yor la wa na leba chu res leba che ani jumba de res.
And this doesn't show it very well, but the dorsal root ganglia are located outside the spinal cord, running the length of the entire spinal cord.
Ta tanda dina rimuna seo shera mendus 이네 탄당 아주 겸을 짜두 주라 겸을 잡으로 도스티다디나 디 콜여라나 줌바이 치려요레스 디나 타와나 탄다 유엔초지도 줌바디 유엔초들라니 디 탄다 짜두딘 주요레스 레레싱 디데레스.
So when you touch something, that information from your fingertip is carried by a dorsal root ganglion axon that travels all the way up here from the dorsal root ganglion neuron located here and then into the spinal cord.
Tatanda di nesu ji rawa inas denene ra di nesu di tanda dage chatin roas gemnu chadu digi di dage chani digi ani gemnu chadu de ma ki res nesu di.
So here you can see this in a cartoon. This is your finger. The dorsal root ganglion neuron senses touch in your finger and then projects into the spinal cord. And then that information is carried into the nervous system up to the thalamus and then the primary somatosensory cortex.
Tatanda di nesu dutan di par na tön sheres dene tanda luso nesu di ya du roas di nesu di kol dur la na tanda gemnu chadu gi dage chadin juras di dene juni ani pa dil di yores jumba na di yores di nesu di jumba ni kol dur la na ya lebu ko du yores lebu ni ya an tanda ngo lesion bi ni juras di bo tang yores.
In this diagram, we're only showing one neuron for simplicity. But in reality, there are many, many synapses in this pathway and many dorsal root ganglion neurons.
Tatanda dina to na wangza tasu rere tön do samana di tab de yo ya chhe tön res ngoy ne chul khari lo na wangza tasu mangu shuji cha do res dina.
So let me pause here to ask if there are any questions about anything I've talked about so far.
Ta tanda bodolo de chisos di na la kana zo ni chiwa yo res.
In the back? Yes. Bonda tanda digido da kinsa tinsa exon la sa deni ni da ta di lokta res la So this information from the physical stimulus, so information is passed on through axon, right? So is it in the form of electrical signal or what? The information? The first step is release of neurotransmitter from the receptor cell onto the dorsal root ganglion neuron. Tanda 먼저 닐린 타봉이라 단 림바 당고디 가르쳐 볼라나 닐린 타봉니 tanda 먼저 경외 자도 주요 자 차수디 딜라 가르 당게 올라와나 왕자 팀바요 딜루요레스. And this happens in the skin. In skin? Yeah. Di khol chungu 올라와나 pakbena chungu roas 왕자 팀발로에디. And then the dorsal root ganglion neuron conveys information by firing action potentials. The nesuji tanda nganzo gyamngil sadu digi chasu delle relarwa wangza chasu delle sa jala din nesudi nganzo khari jun dubor launa lejum nibayo dikotsugu res. So mechanical stimulus causes an opening of the ion channels at the receptor cell, which leads to a release of neurotransmitter, which excites the dorsal root ganglion neuron and causes it to fire action potentials. Tadi dodang khandir lawana chi kujen dikharla na kushu dojroas di ledu wala ani nganzu thanda nilemba nanglo la thanda khedul dosa julam jiyo di khachi gyores di khache sa jala wangze timba dilu gyores wangze timba lo ekengi an thanda nganzu kyabgu chadu jiyo kyabgu chadu di ani lejum ne batum gyores dina.
So every perception it happens at the cerebral cortex, right? So why this message is not directly passed on to the cerebral cortex, because it's passing on through spinal cord, right? Why this information is directly conveyed to the cerebral cortex?
It's a difficult question to answer. So I can only guess that through evolution, this anatomical pathway evolved for a specific advantage to the organism. And one of the most important advantages of our somatosensory system is to protect our bodies from damage. So, for example, for painful stimuli, it's not necessary for me to be consciously aware at the level of the cerebral cortex that I have touched something very, very hot that will burn me. By having a synapse in the spinal cord, the nervous system can create a very rapid connection to motor neurons in the spinal cord that would cause you to withdraw your hand quickly if you touch something hot. And that would happen before you were aware of before you process that information at the level of your cortex. Another reason, and this is complete speculation, is that the somatosensory system is very, the somatosensory system adapts in each of us to our environment. And so, for example, at the level of the cortex, and we'll talk about this in the second lecture this morning, we have a map of the body surface. And that map can change with experience. And that map can also change depending on the density of receptors on our body surface. So we have low-level processing that is very fast and is part of a protective mechanism, so we don't damage our skin. And this low-level processing in the spinal cord is a part of our unconscious behavior. Even as I stand here, I have receptors in my joints that allow me to stand and not fall over. They are constantly monitoring my posture so that I don't fall over. But I don't have to think about that.
Ngaro cha shaina manju de ye lang gore ma riyo mar le ngaro ju ishe diyo marwas di rangshin gi da nanglo le thanda ne le ba de ju ni su ya ma ta ne ni su su khatu lang thu rowas.
Should we get the microphone? Okay.
Tatami sundan ra bujuang sa se bujuang sa ni ya ta jumbar ta jumbar ni ya ni le pun tang le se ti tang sa ti ni jumbar yuan shuo de so ni ina ani da ma tang sa ti ye shuo ma le de ta yana ta gi ka sa buju wang ta te da sumu wang ta ni ko ti yin se ta te ba so ko ti ji ji ni che to wang ta te so te da ni tang sa ti ka so ko ni ju ni ba ji no no ni ta tang sa da ma da se ni tang cho ma re yana lo ke ni ten pe na pho mo ni ko te so ko de ji kha kha se ni ko ta le yo ye na ji ji ni da ni le le ke ni wang ka ni ju ni ba be ta te ba le le te ti le pu ya yu mo ro ma ni le
The Tangbo di Gilai Tua di Kare, Tanda Nichu Dodang Jura, Dusta on that and the Recha the Dew in Dubala, you and Choni do your dodos ra. Nisudi. Mali do ye Choni live your dodos.
Oh, Marbuji, Amani Puji, Nia, Lepu Tang, Subject to Villages and Ma, Umatian, Lepu Matango, Lepus and the Lepa Matan, get on that the young Yeshua Mari to the way.
And nobody.
Nibadi, any kucing cipte ni kami ini bandam atau ini bandam dari sutigi ya datang sati lenju di bawah sati wangsa jirang cik nong itu kita yang nak thati ko bet thati ko jangja ini leput marpaya ini jadi kita ini.
And wangsa thasu cikran jiri ina mangbu yores. Raya na.
Mangbu itu karsa tadi roda tebang itu, roda tebang ni lenju di bawah cik nong itu kita bandam dari situ cuma sama. Ini yang tata kina sumber siapa pena ani kucing mangsa tadi karsa semua mangsa itu jiran tadi ini berdiri ini jiran tadi ini lepun mereka tadi
Dan nilim pada tanda kulam logar rewes lah ni dirwa.
Jiran berdiri.
Oh, dirwa tu. This got that Tibetan but Tibetan someone long or Dordich Karikorlare. Okay, so the information you said about the touch, so it looks like the way you described, the information is received on the left side of the spinal cord and is transferred to the cerebral cortex. And when the cerebral cortex sends information, it looks like from the cerebral cortex, the information is passed on to the right side of the body or the spinal cord. Is it true? Is it right? And there's another question. Maresa thanda thangbo juya thwa thangbo di. Thwa thangbo juya nisu di thanda yun choni thanda yumba la dro an yumba niya le thanda leshu ba du yores. Nisu leshu ni ma ta di ye chodo dos la ra di rewe la du mares. So, and the next question is?
The simple answer is that the information enters the spinal cord at the level of the dorsal root, ganglion, and then it travels through a specific pathway for touch and a separate pathway for pain. The pain pathway crosses and travels in a particular pathway to the other side of the brain up to the cortex. The touch pathway also crosses to the other side of the brain at a different level of the brain, in the hindbrain. In both cases, the right information about the left side of our body travels to the right cerebral cortex.
Nisu di kholi lana thanda jumbe thanda di kamne sadu de lele ruas kamne sadu de le sa jela ni gumba choni ya droni ni leshin badu du ruas ta thanda di do cha shona rekcha da de na thanda anju khari che lana leshin thanda di kamne sadu de da thanda jumba la thanda sadu ji tanda tuzam ji suyo ros dene ne thana shi ta tanda sugun da dewe minus di gi ne su di khande la na jodan di tanda sugun da dewe tanda ne su di la orda di ni tanda gamnyu gi tanda chadu jura di da ani gyumba de tu and dene ne gyumba bran cha shawna thela dwe jura tanda pulam di thela dro and di ne su ni ga tanda di tanda sugun da dewe na re rekcha da dewe na di ni ga hol dhula na lesion la dwe res in a lesion la dwe wala ne chi ko re la na ne lo cha de res korani le sabi an cha shawna subu gi yon chon ni ne su le wa na ne su di lebe gi ne ko la dhula na lebe dum che ni yo ye chon la dwe res thana shi ye chon ni ne su chi ko ge di le wa na sra and di ne su di ko dhula na lebe gi yon chon de dwe res.
So, information from the left side of our body enters the dorsal root ganglion, is conveyed by the dorsal root ganglion neuron into the central nervous system, into the spinal cord, and that's the first synapse. And from there, that information is conveyed by fiber pathways that travel in general to the contralateral side of the brain, where they reach the thalamus first and then the cerebral cortex.
Tadi tanda gamui chadu bi chadu ras tagi zarin digi ani tanda tuzam thambo di khol sur law na jumbo la sur ras di tewe bangza mala na le ras dene ni su di khol dur law na zarin gi gyuni ni ma tanda ne su jodan di ma lebu la li ras and lebu ni ma le shun na tang ras ne su di.
Okay, we have a question here.
Dene tyo ye Jumba da tanda chadu di gamui chadu di para tuzam di le tunzam sungi gi thasu khandi chadu res laborata tuzam di kharigi chashitsi ures labore ra. So when you talk about dorsal root ganglion, which can we say, like, or which part does it belong to? Does it belong to Khandirachi Gyumba Laiba? Does it belong to the spinal cord, or does this root ganglion belong to the receptor part? So which part does it belong if we talk about the dorsal root ganglion?
This is what we call the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, central nervous system. So the dorsal root ganglion, the cell body, or the soma, is outside of the central nervous system, but its axon enters the central nervous system.
Tanda diji doas di nganzo khar lawal na tharne wangza mana chu res di khar na chu la na te wangza mana chu res tanda nganzo di gamui sa du dirwas di cha cha na di gi tanda di thabung suk jiwa di khar la na te wangza mana gi chila res ine di gi dage zarin jiwas di khol le de la na te wangza mana na chu res So it looks like part of this dorsal root ganglion is in the peripheral nervous system and part of it is in the central nervous system. Yes.
So in neuroscience, we tend to localize a cell type or a neuron based on where its cell body is.
So
to avoid confusion. So for example, a motor neuron, its cell body is located here, but it would project its axon out to the muscle. It's still part of the central nervous system.
다 디기 탄다 다게 짜린다 와나 아주 샤네다 튀디게 로스.
Any other questions?
안 지워신 거 yes.
네, 선생님 메티가 메티가 마치 좀 있어요. 마치 좀 있어요. 아니 마치만 숨을 들는 저 요아시와 때문에 이렇게 대시어야 아니 간격하게 됐어요.
마치어데 수무기
마치 좀 있어요. 마치 좀 있어요. 마치 숨을 들어요. 다 나사들이 소리가 좋아져요.
소와디.
좋아져. 요바시와 좀 넣었어. 대가게 됐어.
마추아나 소디 교아도스라니. 소레 디 교알리도스. So if you have two types of injury on your body, one is major and one is minor, so you feel the pain of the injury caused by the minor injury faster as compared to the major injury. The feeling of pain is faster in the minor injury when you compare these two.
In general, we feel, I think it doesn't matter if the injury is large or small, we still feel the pain at the same rate. But pain is a very different sense because there's a component of learning that we can use to control pain and our sense of pain. So there's a lot of processing in pain that is learned and also under conscious control.
The sugula jura di ngara jo gyurim di changhe ro laura changche tangjin che de roji chadures and thanda di gyole shioinas the cheoina re chuaina re gyose di chibare sore. So the rate is same, right?
The rate is same. It's a larger injury will have more pain fibers that are firing. So there'll be more fibers firing if the injury is bigger than a small injury. So the intensity will be greater and it will be received by the cerebral cortex as a larger injury.
Tatanda nichu jura di ni chashawana meryun che de chunga ji shorelara ma che de chashawana di dan dere nanda nasu gi nanda nele balaura di manga ani tanda leju ni ba ke ji shawana di da di manga ki yorwas chunga de duroina and di ma che de chunga do le di nichu dil tani tanda nichu ragyo jura di le shun le ni ani mara ju ma di che di chunga do di ha yo che tu yores ine gyokse chi pa res na di
Okay.
chunga harina.
Let's take one more question and then I want to talk two or three more slides.
tatanda tiwa chigran chi yin sa ta thamaji khandi ngindi khandi gaji
아기 니는 버티는 갖고 니는 시주지요. 니는 시 다디아 땅도가서 땅사디 아니 카바타 카피가 나이 마음으로 카바레레 카피리 얘기하는 이제다 모자 남가 나이 모자 치총 가는 거는 그 남가 치는 거 좋아. 어떻게 가게 스팅이로데
इसको थंबो दिखरे खबर लें को पर खबर
खबर ताकि मनी कोई काचे जे मैंने खबर रेडी करता है रेडी को क्षमा
हां
रेडी रेडी
नमजु तरगु जो खबर दिखे शिवरा हां
जो मंगा ची नहीं पर रेडी करता मेरी कसम की रेडी नहीं या ताऊ दा ताऊ सही ये था कि ये
अले त लोगी तंदा खबर गी थावा लोगा योरवास दिनाशी लोगा छादोरेस याना तंदा मोरे लंगा छिंबु जी शुंगलाम चिनाल मोरे मंगबु दुदवास तिंदे दो छादोरेस. He said this question, so he's not clear about his question. So he said like, is it like the information which is passed on from receptors to the cerebral cortex? Is this information passed on like he gave example of a telephone wire. So we have different wires for different telephones, right? So is this information passed on like information is passed on to different telephones, or is it like a main highway in which there are many cars riding back and forth in this main highway? So which part is true to this information system?
We can think of a highway for pain and a highway for touch as being two separate highways. But then the highway for touch conveys many different types of information that are kept in separate lanes of the highway. So the cars, the information will be in different lanes in the highway for touch, and also different lanes on the highway for pain.
Tadanda di chasho ina sara sungu porangi shunglam loga jures an thana shi shunglam ke je shio ina ra sungu porangi shunglam loga yore thana shi rekja de shunglam loga yores ani sungu chasho ina sungu poran la shunglam na la ya lamba chunji do inde mangbu yo chasha dire thana shi rekja porangi shunglam jora dina la ya lamba chunji do sa do dinde chasha na digures ine porani ge shunglam loga cha digures.
It's more like a highway. It's more like a highway in the United States where you don't change lanes all the time while you're honking your horn.
Dila du kala ta manjo ari gi shunglam do cha de res di imbaina shunglam dinala langa chi simchana thagrang ga do diyoras shere gyo tang gyo mares chikrang ga do diyoras shunglam imbaina dinala yewa chi gyo modo mambu shwa yo ondi langa chunji lawor chik simbaina thagrang ga do diyoras dilo cha de res.
It's not like driving in a tuk-tuk.
Dilo di manjo gyaga do imbaina chik du yo sa dinde mares.
Okay, so let's go on. Well, thank you for those great questions. And I think this next slide might, the next slide please, might be helpful in answering some of your questions as well. So far we've been talking about a specific place, a specific part of your skin, a small location on your skin. In this slide, I want to move to the concept of how is the entire surface of the body mapped into the brain.
Ta thanda ngazo ngai la pesu khari shar lawana pakbe gitne chunju jile ni shai bas ta thanda dina saptana khari urlana pakbe samai chorju ra dila du ne loga changma gi ani thanda lebe na ne chu khari tu urla jora di ani sapta ta uch question res.
So this is a little bit complex to understand, but we have regions of the body surface that are called dermatomes. And they're indicated by these dashed regions. Okay?
Ta thanda di this gosuya khapo yores nyojin rojo yores ta dina la khari urla na ngazo subu gi ne loga la dermatome la yores ta dermatome rere khari chungor la na thanda dela tongba tis shadwa di dermatome rere chung yores.
And each of these regions which runs around our body is innervated by a particular group of neurons from the dorsal root ganglia.
Ta dana ngazo ne rere di ro cha shana dine ne jik cha ruas di ani khari da thu dur la na thanda ngazo cha du gyamwe cha du juwas di ge wangza tha sub da de cha du res.
So we can divide the skin based on how it's innervated from the dorsal root ganglia.
Ta dana ngazo di thanda pakwe di thanda wangza gyamwe cha du juwa di da ani khandis thu me di thanda dina tuen she res parna.
So to explain this figure, this is the brain.
Ta di remove the she gya na skang di khare la na leber res.
And here is the spinal cord.
Di tumba dress wa de.
Scientists have numbered the different levels of the spinal cord based on cervical or thoracic or lumbar, for example. So each part of the spinal cord has been divided into a group of segments.
Dila dugola thanda manzo gyungba jidwa dinal cha na rimba do la ora tinde ewa lo che sheres ani tanda dinal la mangbu ji du sha gyo gang cha na denze jingbe khuila ni sha do tinde ta sheres lo wa ewa che du ani niwa di khari cha de la na thong thang gi khuila ni sha sheres sumba de ani khedung gi khuila tinde ewa che ni sha sheres.
So in the case of the thoracic segments, which are we have the most of here, the thoracic segments, the dorsal root ganglion neurons from each lie outside of each one of these segments.
Ta thanda di ne re tun dos thanda thang gi khuila ni mangbu shwa chunju di ani khari da dewa chadur la na thanang ju subu na pakwa ten doas di da dewa chadur res.
So for a dorsal root ganglion neuron that's in 1, 2, 3, 4, T5, it will be localized here. It will respond to sensory information from the skin in this strip on our body called right here.
Ta tanda changi khuji do dinal khesi ngawa dila che ni sha do di cham ngawa dile na di tanda khari la yalin chiru la na manju wangsor ke ne chu tanda lingi tanda de T5 lan ta gya sha do ni chi de la khesi ne chu ji chung wa na tanda chu bu gen do le na di ne chu de yalin chinge phagi ngawa di cha de res.
Whereas the dorsal root ganglion neurons that are located outside of L5 would innervate this patch of skin.
Ta tanda L5 bana mangbu sha do di ne di da khari thu de la na di pa ngawa sha do di thu de res.
And this system of innervation from the dorsal root ganglia probably evolved over time from our ancestors when we walked on all fours.
Ta tanda di gyo dre jura di ngonzo pheju dre res di khane ni pheju dre la na maran so mebo koran so imba na company combajan tungi di chayo maras shija chu ni du ras dini ning chen thanda bodo ni pheju dre res di kemoi cha du di.
It's not important that you memorize this. I don't want you to memorize this.
Ta di ta du golo mangbu shu ju dos di samma kiran zo ngado ju bo ni yo mares di.
But it has some important medical implications.
Na di khari da dewa chabi la na main da dewa ta nishi da di dewa chabi was.
So when someone has surgery on their leg, for example, the doctor can block pain by injecting an anesthetic at this level of the dorsal root ganglion to block the nerve endings going out to the leg.
Ta kangba do cha sha na ta main da dewa la do la sha ju kangbo sha ju chi ai mai na sra ta di kan do wang za ni gyu ta da chi ku gen di ma le chi du ma ju gi di da de ta da cha du ju ra ni khari ki ge na di ka she yu res khap ge ni.
And that would allow the rest of the body to continue to feel somatosensory information, but it would block somatosensory information from the leg, which would allow the surgery to happen without feeling pain.
Hina di ka wala do wala ta da kangba ni ne su le ju ra ya jumba ba do di ne su di ka ta da cha du ba do ka she yu res hina jumba ni ya le ba do ne su de di nam ju ru do de res di ka ya ma res.
Also, if a patient goes to a doctor and they have pain in their leg and they don't know the cause, the doctor can use this information to figure out which level of the dorsal root ganglia or spinal cord the pain may be.
Di le ta kangba na yo na ne ba di da khawal na yo me di shi me na sra an me ba khari ta ji chigla na da gyamnu cha du ju di gi ba di ta ni ani na sa di khaw me ani che ju res.
And this is why some kinds of pain actually travel in different parts of the body. So for example, some kinds of pain in the back actually cause a pain sensation or burning sensation in the leg also.
Kabre khari la na ta da gyap cho gi sumu ju ra di khawal chu la na kangba la chore ju ra di di res.
So physicians can use this information to actually identify the cause of and the location of the pain.
Chezanda naza nishi di ta khaw yo me ju ra sumu di khaw yo me che ju la kunju gi thanda di pheju chi res.
Okay, so you also had some questions about the pathways for somatosensory information, and I want to just spend a minute or two before tea break, and I'll come back to this after tea break in the next slide, showing you the representation of the body surface in the cerebral cortex. So this is a review. We've already talked about sensory information coming from the skin through the dorsal root ganglion into the spinal cord, and then traveling through the spinal cord to the thalamus, and then to the primary somatosensory cortex. This afternoon, or in the second lecture today, I'll be talking about what happens in this part of the brain, in the somatosensory cortex. And the interesting and curious phenomenon about our somatosensory system is that the left side of our body is mapped topographically onto the right side of our somatosensory cortex.
Tanda di kyarjong ro chayo res no jodandi ni sudi tanda sugu chi papa ni le onso mala jodandi andi ne di kyamwe chadu di ni sudi kyungba la ti yoras kyungba ni ya ani le bo la te le bo ni le shun do yoras ta manzo tanda le shun do cha sha na di le shun di kor la ni jela soje percent jela ti is te ne ara jo subu do ta wa na chi khario la na yuen chogi ni sudi manzo sara ro ko na le be gi ye cho de le de ras.
So what you're looking at in this diagram is a slice through the cerebral cortex. This is closest to the midline, and this is midline, and then this is closest to the outside lateral edge here. So we're looking at a slice through the somatosensory cortex.
Tanda wansur da relation juros di hezi shashawaina di chasha res shayoj and di tanda ki di chadores di tacho di chadores.
And a very important neurologist named Wilder Penfield discovered when he was trying to figure out where to do surgery on patients that had epilepsy, he discovered this map.
The Sane Poena Zashto, the Jin Dugalata, the Wanza Seriba, Wanza member Jures, Wilder Herfield and Korangita, and D and the Sane Podugala Mazuki, Lishun and the Sarah Hadiku Lajura, D any Dilatani and Korangidi, Salto de Suisha Jures, Sane Chungres.
So you know for many kinds of epilepsy there's damage to a particular region of the cortex that causes the person to have those seizures.
The Sane Poes da di Yoinas and Mazuta and Lishungi, ne chick that they all chadures, di kingi any Sane Poti, any the Chires.
And so the neurosurgeon wants to remove just that part of the cortex that's causing the seizures.
Tatanda di kangi Tejura, di tingi Kuchi Yor Lara Lishunal, di Anit and the Wanze member the Zukarchilana, di Kudi Nidi, Mapishi Yures, Livani, Yures.
So in the process of trying to figure out the region of the brain causing the epilepsy, Dr. Penfield discovered this map of the body surface in both the somatosensory and the motor cortex.
Tanashi Tanda Tadi, Sane the Povedi, Devani Korangi Tanda, di Sara the Queres and Shira, this Saradi Tanda, Wangsur that Jewichibu Maiba, Yobu that Devinigal Sweet Korangi Queres Saradi.
And the map has some funny properties to it. So for example, the largest portion of the map is devoted to our representation of the hand.
The Tanda di Sara Tawana, Keju Kashi Kensal Jures, and Tanda di Sara Tawana, the Lishungi ne, Mangcha Rojredos, di Karigi Lelurlana, La Veni di Redos. Di Chazani Tawana, ne digas lana ne Chimush Nera, La Bachibuchi digas Simdos.
So the most space in the map is devoted to the areas of our body where we have the highest density of sensory receptors in the skin.
The Kavas Chotuana Tanda di Rochashana Laparas, and di Nedi, Karida George Hadur Tanamazu Lape, or Nilim Bayora, Monsor the Digas Nedi George Hadur.
And in addition to very many receptors in this part of the surface of our hand, not this, but this, we also have a very high density of receptors around our mouths.
And the dinner tower, la big muela de la big gap de mares, doing the modishi res, and Tanashi Nilum, but Chick Mambo Harichadula, Namazu Karine Dishdo, Dizantio Chadures.
Have you ever watched a baby when it's learning to crawl and it explores the environment by putting everything into her mouth?
The Kiranzo Puchu Dinzo, the Kondro Gapo Zuda, the Gapsu Tonyo US, the Kondro Joy Capsu, Franzo Carsilana, Kondro Gary Capsoni, La Walla Carito, and Tama Kana Judas.
So the baby is learning about objects both with her hands and with her mouth.
Dilade pugudi di chiwe kapsu khari jangyo lawana ngobudi jang korla jangyo res di khari gyuni jangor lawana lapada khari gyuni jangyo res ngobudi korla.
And in this map, the other funny thing is we have very little representation of our back. I can't even find it. Trunk. This is our back. This is our trunk. Tiny little space.
Leshun dina chashawana ta ne dil tawana ne chunjuj mashi ngazo gyalai simyo maresti ne chunjuj mashi ta changyo mares.
And so in your own experience you can relate to this because you know that you're much more sensitive to things that you pick up or touch with your hands than touch on your back.
Dida susu itsoran gyuni sheturwas ngobodo imbaina di susu gitsore soro gelu tawana lawe itsordu bala ngobodi khari meda di yaga hakudo as gelda durwainas.
Okay, so let's take a break for tea and come back in half an hour.
Ta chudu chewa soja krasin pe ndi jele geldo jeyo.